Alright, greetings friends. This is just a sound check. If you could let me know if you can hear me by typing a Y on the text chat. So sounds coming through clearly. Very good. So obviously we've only just kicked off, so I'll just slowly get into this to allow a few more people to join. I think I have neglected to go auto join, so it might be that I have to manually let people in as they come, but we'll just flow with it. So welcome everybody to the webinar of today, and of course the title is the 5 Pathways of Ascension. So this is going to be one of the more profound webinars that I've ever delivered, I would say. Not at all because I'm the one that's delivering it, but because of the information that I'm going to be discussing. It's extremely powerful information. So you'll have to once again just forgive me for taking a gentle break from time to time as I'm letting people in as they turn up, right? I'm just doing so now. So the topics of conversation for today's webinar is I'm going to go over what Ascension actually is. I'm going to define it, and that's going to take a little bit of talking and quite a lot of images to get across this profound concept, which is very intangible for most. So we'll move through that first, and these other things are not necessarily in order. This is just what we're going to cover for today, right? So toward the end of the webinar, or second half we should say, I'm going to go over the 5 of the most important and powerful elements related to this. And I think you'll find that you'll be able to relate to each of them, and that they're also reasonably intangible because they're so all-encompassing. That being said, that gives them their power because you can contain so much within one of each of these elements, right? So I'm also going to detail a shortcut or a master key for each of these elements. In other words, something simple that you can apply in your own life that is going to allow this element to become much stronger or have a greater presence and power in your life. Of course, as we go through this, you're going to become well aware as to why this knowledge is so important in general, but particularly now. We're going to take a quick look at, as we move through it, where people are getting stuck, which I'm sure everybody will be able to relate to as well. And of course, I'm going to cover what the true solutions are for these great challenges that we face. So at the end of the webinar there, I'm going to offer a golden opportunity. I'll say a little bit more about that toward the end, of course. You'll find out more about that as we proceed as well and accumulate this knowledge. So if I could suggest, you might have a glass of water with you handy. This is going to be pretty intense. The information is very powerful. It's very high frequency information. And your body will probably be vibrating by the end of the webinar. So let's get stuck into it. So, Ascension defined. Now, of course, in most people's contexts, they associate the word ascension with a physical ascension, right? So this is an elevation in direct opposition to gravity, such as a hot air balloon does. Now, there's actually a parallel there that we're going to come back to at a later point, in that we're filling the hot air into the balloon, aren't we? And that's what's causing it to elevate. In other words, the air relative to the air outside the balloon is actually of a higher energy. That's why it's hotter. And so that is why the balloon is elevating. So we're going to come back to that physically relatable element as well at a later point. But on to what is intended to be defined is, of course, dimensional ascension. And this is a very intangible concept, most commonly associated with the Master Jesus, as he allegedly ascended into space, into heaven, as it were. And so this is actually an elevation through space and time. So if that's what it is, then we're going to have to define what it is that space and time is. And so this is going to take a significant amount of the focus of this webinar because it's such a profound concept. So just before I go into this information, I'm going to share a bit more information about where the sources are that I'm getting this information, because it's just not coming from me, right? So here is an article that I just picked up off the internet recently. You'll see the title, of course, Aliens Exist and Trump Almost Let It Slip, says an Israeli professor. And so you can see the date there, it's December 9th, 2020. And what he's basically saying is that Earthlings have been in contact with extraterrestrials from our galactic federation. So that's not just some random hippie saying that. That's a professor involved in the space program in Israel, right? Former Israeli space security chief, in fact. So, of course, he sent eyebrows shooting, as it were. What's going on there? Oh, sorry, that's just the end of the video. So, as you can imagine, if he started talking about that, from that level of authority, that's going to get people thinking, wow, that's pretty interesting, right? So here's another source that I also listen to. This is Dr. Michael Salla. He's done a lot of research on this. And this is just one example of one of his books, which I have, US Air Force Secret Space Program, Shifting Extraterrestrial Alliances in Space Force. So although a lot of people don't know much about this topic, there are some that know a lot about it. And if you read into it, you'll become aware that there is actually a lot to be known, and that is available to us. So these sources that the Israeli professor referred to, well, they go by many names, and I'm just going to list a few here that are commonly used. The Galactic Federation of Light, Confederation of Planets is another term that is used, the Interdimensional Association of Free Worlds, and the Guardian Alliance is another name that is very familiar to me as well. And I'm not sure as to exactly what the difference is between all of these. You'd probably have to go off planet or something to work that out. But obviously they are all similar terms relating to perhaps slightly different groups within this whole field of intelligence existing beyond the Earth. So as it relates to what I'm about to go through in relation to the information, this is referred to as the Guardian Alliance that have been giving this information. And so I got this information from this book here, particularly actually the second book, volume 2 of the Voyager's material, The Secrets of Our Mente. And Ashiana Dean was trained from very young, like in the single digits. She was contacted by the Priests of Light, by the Galactic Federation, as it were, but in particular the Priests of Earth, they call them the Priests of Light, from the inner Earth, and also from various areas within the Guardian Alliance that are external to the Earth. And she was trained to deliver this information very carefully over a long period of time, through which she could receive it through a transmission style called Kilonta. And so what that essentially means is that the information is delivered directly into her brain through a means called direct cognition, through the medium of vibration, sound, and light. So in other words, she directly receives the information. It uploads into her brain like massive packets of data, and then it takes her many, many months to unpacket that and to bring it down to a way that we can recognize what it means, which is what these books essentially are, right? So one interesting thing about them is the last time I looked at these books in the Amazon, it was $7,000 for this book, The Secrets of a Mente, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. That is so ridiculous that a book would be $7,000, and I really don't think that it's because that's just the relative value. It's a priceless book, of course, but submitting more people here. But $7,000, doesn't that just say something? Okay, so someone, perhaps associated with Jeff Bezos or something, they don't really want this book getting around, right, at some point. And so the other thing I noticed most recently when I checked is that it's actually currently unavailable. We don't know when or if this item will be back in stock. So they don't even know if it's going to be back in stock. So that sort of says a lot, doesn't it? You can't even get hold of this. Now, you could probably get hold of this book if you went online and contacted, not such a massive retailer as Amazon. You'll be able to get hold of it. I don't know how much, maybe a few hundred. You'd have to check, but it's a very, very profound book. And if you were to read it, you would immediately see what I mean there, right? So this is the books that I'm referring to and the source of this information that I'm about to go through. So I'm going to talk about creation mechanics, and this is an incredibly profound topic of conversation that would get perhaps some religious types a bit upset. Nevertheless, I'm just going to share it as I understand it in relation to how it's been shared through that material, right? So we have this concept of primary consciousness, or God, the source of life in the universe and beyond, etc., right? Now, the reason that I've used that silver-pointed star, 5-pointed star with the golden ring around it in blue, is because this master, Paramahansa Yogananda, who's well known to the spiritual community from his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, he was known as a Premavatar, and when he went into this state, the self-realized state, this God-realized state through which one can perceive themselves to be this primary source of consciousness, referred to as God, he said that he sees this 5-pointed star in his forehead, in his third eye, ringed in gold, and that the way that he moves into that God-realized state is by penetrating his consciousness through the 5-pointed star. So it's just a symbol that I've used that I feel about is reasonably relevant, and he's very well accredited to reference. This is one of the books that he's written, God Talks with Arjuna, the Bhagavad Gita. That's his translation of the Royal Science of God Realization, through which he describes exactly how to achieve this experience, right? It's a very, very profound scripture, dear to the Hindu's heart. And any Vedic scholar, he of course gave this translation, the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of the Christ within you, which, incredibly enough, he said that the Master Jesus actually came to him directly, manifested in front of him, and conversed with him specifically regarding what he meant by each phrase, each and every phrase in the Bible. So there we have two incredible scriptures that have been translated by a God-realized master. So if you're wanting to find an authentic source of information, irrespective of your beliefs or religion, I would really encourage you to consider looking into that. So anyway, that's a little bit of a side note to that image there. Now, what we have here with creation mechanics is that this primary consciousness comes forth from within the void. And the way I imagine the void is that if you were in the middle of space with no planets, no stars, nothing, and you were just surrounded by emptiness, nothingness, eternal, I don't know, blackness perhaps. You don't even have directions, you don't have space and time, because there's no point of reference. There's only a singular consciousness. So if you close your eyes and imagine yourself floating in that void, well, perhaps that may be a little bit what that was like before everything expanded. But apparently the first thing, according to these beings in the Guardian Alliance, that this primary consciousness, or the source of life, created was a vibration. So a movement of mind, we could say of thought, that created a vibrational tone of energy that became what we know as sound, right? And so that this vibration, this fundamental primal vibration, became what is known as the primal sound fields, which people also referred to as the cosmic trinity. This is also related to what the Hindus and Vedic scholars refer to as the word Om, and why people chant that word in yoga class, etc. It is also related to what the the Christians refer to as the Word. So in the Bible it says, and then first was the Word. So what is a word? Of course, when you speak, and I'm doing that now, you are simply modulating sound tones that convey meaning or carry consciousness, isn't it? So initially, these first 3 layers of sound were created according to these profound cosmic beings. Now, they refer to this as the energy matrix, and this is not yet within time because it doesn't have a point of reference outside of union or singular consciousness, although there are varied perspectives, we could say, within that, allegedly. There is not yet separation. There is only unified awareness. So that one of the best ways that we can most simply explain what I'm about to talk about is this thing here. Now, this is called plate resonance. I'm just going to get it going. And here's a beautiful quote here. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration, by Nikola Tesla. Just turning down the sound there. I hope you can hear my voice. There's a soundtrack that goes with this, but just notice this. And I'm sure some people have seen this before, but I like to show it again because it's such a wonderful reference. But we essentially have a tone modulator here that vibrates the metal plate using a tone generator. So as the tone increases, of course, you actually hear, or you actually see, that there's a change in the way in which the particles have organized themselves. Now we're talking about material particles here, so they're putting on, now I'm assuming that's probably just sand. And as the frequency or the tone or vibration that is passing through the plate is increased, what you find is there is a different geometrical pattern that occurs within the particles of the sand right there, which is representing, of course, matter or light indeed. Because light, of course, has particles too. They're called photons, aren't they? So you can see there, as the frequency is increasing, there is a continued change in the sacred geometry. Now I'm going to move on from here. I want you to keep that in mind with regard to what I'm about to talk about, right? So allegedly, according to these profound beings within the Guardian Alliance, the next thing this great consciousness does, this primal consciousness, is that it creates light, right? So immediately, now I would assume perhaps that means the initial formations of the very first suns as radiant spheres of light, and so then gives birth to what we refer to as the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So as you can see, if you're not educated about this, what we have right up at this end of the electromagnetic spectrum is very short wavelengths, very powerful wavelengths, and so the smaller you go down in wavelength, in representative size, it's also becoming very, very small. So in here, what is called gamma ray, we're referring in size of wavelength to what is the atomic nucleus here, or smaller, so subatomic particles. As you can imagine, as it becomes smaller and smaller, we're moving into cosmic rays, which becomes incredibly small, moving toward what scientists call the Planck scale. And as we move upward in size, you move into X-rays. Here they've got an atom or a virus. As we're moving through this way, ultraviolet, a bacterium, pinhead as we're approaching visible light here. So that as the light wave is approaching into the visible light spectrum, it's coming into the range of our sensory perception, isn't it? Like a pinhead. Okay, well, can you see anything much smaller than a pinhead? Probably not, without the help of an electron microscope, etc. And then as light continues to expand in the wavelength, you have here at 1 meter plus a human figure. So that's the relative measurement. And radio wave skyscrapers, Mount Everest here at 10 to the power of 6. So the point being here is that the wavelength of the light organizes the level of manifestation within the light field, right? So the frequency or the vibration determines the size of the frequency field. So let's take a little bit more of a look at that. So initially, this great being is said to have created what is referred to as the primal light fields, which is also known as, that's not supposed to say the cosmic trinity, sorry, that's the universal trinity. And this is what we would refer to in the Bible when there is the phrase, of course, in Genesis, let there be light, right? The next thing after the word was light was created. And if you're familiar with these concepts, just bear with me. I'm just going to talk to this as if someone is relatively new to these ideas, although they've been, of course, floating around for millennia, of course. Now, one example of this frequency of energy is what is referred to in this book here, The Seven Sacred Flames by Aurelia Louise Jones, and she talks about these 7 primordial cosmic rays through which the rest of creation is birthed, right? So when we're talking about that, I'm going to refer back to this at a later point, we're talking about these primordial rays that were created in the first field of light, unified light. So the next thing this great being, cosmic being, created was what these beings referred to as the 4th harmonic universe. So I've put the number 1 next to that because really it's the first harmonic universe outside of this primal light field, right? Because when they give us information, they're of course giving us information from our perspective. Whereas realistically, of course, no, this was the first one. We just like to have it in a way that we can relate to, which will make a bit more sense later. So has anyone here looked at Corey Goode's material? He's a secret space program insider who has a lot of people following him on the internet. He's got incredibly fascinating information, if your mind can handle that, we could say. So, so that's familiar to at least a few people there. Well, in his testimonials, right, he refers to these golden triangle-headed beings. So those that have heard his testimony will be familiar with. And so I'm just assuming here, I don't know this is for sure, but I'm assuming that perhaps because of the way that he described these beings, is that when he described them, he said that they have a fluid kind of ethereal form, like they're not even physical, they're kind of like a shimmering hologram, and they kind of move from side to side with a fluid nature. So that I'm assuming, I'll just as a side note, there's an example of one of his discussions when he was at this meeting with the Blue Avians and these beings called the Sentinels, and there was this great light communication between all of these beings, and he was there to observe this, apparently. And this golden triangle-headed being, he's allegedly about 14 or 12 or 14 feet high, so incredibly huge. But if you want to look further into that, I suggest just look that up, golden triangle-headed being. I can't imagine there's too many other references of that on the internet in relation to Corey Goode. You'll find more on it. But I think that they're probably around about existing in this 4th harmonic universe, or the first one, which is made out of liquid hydroplasmic light, according to these Guardian Alliance beings. So I'd put them perhaps there. This 5th harmonic universe, we could say, that was established first, when we're talking about beings that exist here, we're talking about ascended, legitimate, type 1, 2, and 3 ascended masters, right? So as this being creates further and further what are called densities, or playgrounds through which experience can take place, the next harmonic universe is birthed, and as this takes place, which is known as the harmonic universe number 3, now this is moving from liquid hydroplasmic light into silica-based biological complexes. In other words, the body forms are crystalline, right? Now, consistent with Corey Goode's testimonial, you'll also be familiar, perhaps more so familiar, with the Blue Avians. Now, I don't know, again, if this is entirely correct. I'm sort of putting 2 and 2 together, as it were, but the Guardian Alliance, when they refer to this particular information, they refer to the 3rd harmonic universe and the silica-based biology crystalline structure. They say that the Ra Confederacy comes from this universe here, and that when these beings refer to themselves, well, the one that speaks directly to Corey refers to himself as Ra Tia Ir. And he also, interestingly enough, refers to himself not in a personal sense, but as a collective mind. And so those that have followed the likes of David Wilcock will be well familiar with the Ra material, which is said to be a communication from what is called a social memory complex, which is a collective of beings that are so in tune with each other that they literally operate as one being. So if you can imagine that the human experience, each one of us as individuals was so psychically in tuned to each other that we knew everything about each other. Now just think about what needs to happen for that to take place. You've got to have no secrets, don't you? So you've got to be pretty, we could say, pure, don't you? To arrive at that space of clarity and open-hearted willingness to share of yourself, because how could you arrive at that space of psychic integrity if you had some dark element within your heart that you didn't want someone to know at? You'd shut yourself off, and therefore your energy field wouldn't allow you to share. So just imagine how impeccable these beings are, that they are completely unafraid and completely willing to share absolutely everything that they are with each other, and thereby can work as a collective consciousness. So that's as another side note. Now, as this incredible consciousness extended itself into the next, what is called harmonic universe number 2, now the actual body structure has moved on to silica-based biology. So I've actually, sorry, I've messed that up with the slides. It's supposed to be carbon silica. I think I've fixed it up. I've got so many slides in this presentation that it's not going to be impeccable, so just work with me here. But in any case, so now the biology is starting to take on more of a carbon form within it, right? And as we know, in relation to carbon, if you compress it enough, it becomes a diamond, right? Which of course reflects light. It's a crystal, as a side note to that. So that is the next harmonic universe that is formed, the next playground, we could say, that consciousness can evolve into. And we are becoming more and more dense, more and more toward material nature as we move into this, what is called the harmonic universe number 2 from our perspective, right? Now, as a side note to that, I'm sure many people will be familiar with Krishna, Rama, and the likes of the Hindu religion. The Mahabharata talks about these blue beings that have come to the rescue of humankind in the ancient past. And so these great beings that have communicated through this material that Ashiana Dean has brought through the Guardian Alliance, they refer to these beings as the Syrian Council, the Syrian Blues, and they are living in apparently what is known as the second harmonic universe, which is one entire, I don't know if octave is the right word for this, but if you understand, perhaps someone that knows more about sound, a musician would know more, for example, is that you move up the musical scale, and once you get to a certain level of notes, is it G something or other, flat perhaps, then it drops back down to A again, but in an entirely different octave of sound frequency, right? So that is how this correlates with that initial video that I showed you of the plate resonance, is that their sound tones are organizing light and matter into vibrational bases that assimilate into what we could say three-dimensional playing fields through which experience can occur, right? So these blue Syrians, allegedly their guardian race that come from the second harmonic universe there. Now, this is certainly has a correlation here with Yogananda and the Bhagavad Gita, of course, which is being assimilated from the Mahabharata, which relates to this great epic of when these Syrian blues intervened in the Indian culture many, many thousands of years ago, perhaps 8 to 10 or 12,000 years ago, during the Battle of Atlantis, and when that went under, etc., which we're not going to go into today. Now, as the creation continued to extend itself, allegedly then, and this is where we can begin to relate, it moved into what is referred to by these beings as the first harmonic universe, when carbon-based biology was formed, right? And so this is what is referred to as Earth. This is the first experience, or the furthest out into density that creation has expanded. And so a being associated with this level, although he certainly doesn't exist, we could say materially on this level, is Mahavatar Babaji, and he is a well-known spiritual figure all around the world who is also significantly associated with not only the Syrian blues and Krishna being one of his mentors, but also Paramahansa Yogananda and all of the Indian masters. So this, for example, if we are to relate to this, is where we have the three dimensions of solid, liquid, and gas that formulate the experiential reality field that we can relate to. And there's an image there that really paints the picture, doesn't it? We have the beach there, we have the oceans, or the beach represents the ground or the land mass. The oceans represents the fluid layer, which is the next level of frequency, otherwise known as a dimension of energy that sits upon the physicality of the land mass. The third dimension being the gas or the atmospheric base, which provides a further reduction in material density. So this is where our experience is all carried out, isn't it? For the most part. Now, I'm going to share an experience with you just to sort of make this, what I'm about to talk about, more vivid. At one point I was lying down, and of course this guy's got a much cooler haircut than me. This is not me. And also it's a very bright room. My room wasn't bright. It was early in the morning, because in the early morning when you are just sort of waking up and you're coming out of your delta wavelength of mind oscillation, we could say, or frequency of brain patterns, then this is a very good time as you move through theta and before you move into the alpha state to start consciously doing things. When you're in theta, this is a really good time to actually project your consciousness out of the body. Now, this can only happen, by the way, if you've activated to a degree your fourth DNA strand, which I'm going to get into shortly. But in any case, at this particular experience, now this is about in 2010, I think. I was in Clarence Street, Sydney CBD, lying in my bed in the morning, and this portal opened up in my third eye. And it was amazing because I could see out my physical eyes, so I could see the top of the ceiling fan, the surroundings, the wardrobe. But I could see in the center of my forehead that there was this luminous portal, and directly within the portal, and this is quite a almost accurate image, it's just that that's a wave through there, but it was moving, of course. So I was looking through this luminous portal in my forehead, and there were these enormous waves, like this tidal motion was moving like up. This swell was like it was 5 or 10 seconds as this swell moved up and then down, so I could tell that it was absolutely enormous. In any case, what I could best describe as I dove through the portal. Now, when you go to astral project, if you go to make a physical movement, what you'll find is that you snap back into the physical because your intention activates your nervous system, which is the physiological way in which you activate the muscular system, right? Through the neuromuscular connection, and you'll get up or you'll sit up. So as you're learning to astral project, this is a very difficult skill because you can only really relate to movement in a sense that your neurobiological connection. But in this case, anyway, I was aware enough to intend it and intend my consciousness through the portal. And so that as I dove down through this tunnel and moved into this world, we could say, which I can only assume was the second harmonic universe, the astral field, the angelic field and the archetypal field of dimensions 4, 5, and 6, then what I immediately saw was that there is an island, probably, I don't know, 500 meters distant. The other thing that I noticed next was that I was levitating above this great swell of this enormous ocean of waves. And the next thing I noticed is that it was almost as if there was a gentle sun. I wouldn't say underneath the water, I would say emanating from within every atom of the water. And so the water was self-luminous. And as I once again intended, I soared and flew toward the beach and landed upon the beach and picked up the sand and was once again amazed that the sand, every sand particle, was luminescent and shining from a light within it. As I walked along and touched the trees, they were alive. I remember placing my hand against this palm tree. It was, it kind of looked like a pineapple tree in between a palm and a pineapple tree. And as I placed my hand on it, my hand kind of sunk into the tree and it shivered and its branches were like, if that makes sense, right? So anyway, I continued on and I talked to beings there. I talked to families, which was incredible. I went to a different location where there was obviously a civilization complex. And so I'm just sharing that with you now so that you can relate a little bit more to this experience, or we could say an extra dimensional experience through which you can project your consciousness into one of these, what I'm interpreting as one of the higher harmonic universes, right? So I'm going to talk to that a little bit more as we move along, and there's that image representation of that experience there. I've of course had many similar sort of experiences, although I haven't really focused on that, to be honest, and I'm just catching myself realizing that I'm probably talking a little bit too much here. There's a lot of slides to move on, so you'll have to excuse me if I cut through and don't go into so much detail, otherwise we just won't get through this all. There'll be mixed feelings. Perhaps some people are going to be like, hurry up, you're boring me. Others might be, no, keep going. So I'm just going to go with my intuition here. But in any case, so these different playgrounds are known. So the second harmonic universe representation of Earth is known as Terra, right? According to these great beings that give us this information. The third harmonic universe is known as Gaia, the silicate-based frequency field. The next one up in that hydroplasmic liquid light realms is known as Aramatena, right? So as it relates to the Ascension talk, the star seed talk, we could say, there's these different concepts, and it can be very confusing. Now, again, I'm not sure exactly if this is correct, but this is how I'm interpreting what it means. The way in which people are referring to the ascension of the Earth, if that's a familiar topic, is that we're moving from third density to fourth density. And I think that that's a little confusing because some people, particularly if you follow online streams via Facebook or whatever, chat rooms, people are asking, well, what is the difference between a dimension and a density? And now I've just added in this new concept to some perhaps called a harmonic universe. It all starts to become quite confusing, but here it is. This is what I interpret this as. The first harmonic universe is the combination of three different dimensional fields. Consequently, of course, there are three different directions. There's forward, backwards, up and down, left and right, that you can move within that three-dimensional construct of three-dimensional layers of energy. The fourth dimension being your consciousness perceiving or looking down upon those three levels of frequency or dimensions, which is how our experience occurs, right? So the way I'm perceiving that it's being spoken of in terms of density is that the first density is the mineral kingdom, right? This is the landmass, the rocks, the elements that have a very solid physical density to. Now the second density is the fluid kingdom, right? Once again, less density. There are all manner of things that are in a fluid nature. The third density being the atmospheric base, and that when you move into what we could say the fourth dimension, which is that green band of energy there, as it relates to these pictures, this is really just the first dimension of the fourth density, right? Or what the Guardian Alliance have referred to as the second harmonic universe. Sound, frequency, and vibration organizing, in this case, coarse light particles into a frequency field that I've just kind of vividly described in my personal experience there, through which we can experience on the soul level, right? So on and so forth. As we go up the harmonic scale, you have the 7th and the 8th and 9th dimensions forming the 5th density or third harmonic universe. And so that when we refer to 6th density, and this has been related by Corey Good and David Wilcott, for example, is where these great beings come from. And there's a little bit of ambiguity. I think the Ra material refers to themselves as a 6th density consciousness. So, of course, previously when I talked about this as it related to what the Guardian Alliance have said and where the Ra Confederacy exists, is actually in this this third harmonic universe at the metagalactic core, right? So obviously a little bit of ambiguity between 5th and 6th density there, but I don't know. Again, I'm not the authority here. I'm just referring information which I'm sure is pretty interesting, right? So 7th density, of course, being associated with that divine highest level of intelligence as it relates to what is manifested within the time matrix, right? So when it refers to time, I finally arrive at this point where I can talk about time in a way that's actually going to make more sense, isn't it? So the difference, of course, between the time matrix and the energy matrix is that you can't have time without polarity, right? And what I mean to say is polarity is that there's me and you, there's spirit and there's soul, there's here and there's there. There are all sorts of perceptions arising out of the, we could say, the illusion of separation that is created by two different points of reference. So if there's me and there's you, and you're standing over there and I'm standing over here, this is how a time is created, isn't it? Because it's going to take a measure of time for either information in the form of communication or travel for me to get to you as we perceive it to be. So it's a little bit of a confusing concept, isn't it, between unity and separation consciousness, and we really have to talk about it in a sense of a philosophical view, because for most of us we're really not perceiving that ultimate unity in which we actually perceive each other, as it were, to be ourselves, if that makes sense. So the time matrix occurs within the light universes, right? And as soon as you go outside of that into the energy matrix, you are now completely unified consciousness. There is no time. So if you can imagine, now when we talk about dimensional ascension, now let's take our little chakra man here as an example and utilize that. We're going to look at this section here as we further look into what these dimensions really mean in a practical, relatable way, right? So Ascension mechanics. We've moved on from creation mechanics. I hope that makes sense, and we now have a context through which we can look at this and have that also make sense. So Ascension mechanics, he's our little Ascension man here, our chakra man, and so most people that have any spiritual understanding, of course, will have an understanding of the chakras. It's your base chakra, sacral, your solar plexus, heart chakra is your throat chakra, your third eye or brow chakra, as it were, and then your crown. Now, of course, each of these chakras are associated with a different level of consciousness, and so that the way in which this works is that each chakra is running the dimensional bandwidth corresponding to what we just talked about as those frequencies of or various levels of manifestation come out from Prime Creator. And so each of these are dimensions, right? And the way that it works is that you actually have an element of your DNA existing in each of these dimensions, so that when we look at the first dimension, for example, well, the first dimension is associated with the first chakra, or the base chakra, which, as we know, if you even undertake the basic level of study in relation to chakras, is associated with the physicality, the physical body. It's often related to money, because money buys things that you need on a physical level, amidst other things. And so it's associated with what we can feel on a physical context, right? So when you look under the microscope at the DNA, you will see a physical representation in the form of the double helix bonds, right? They're physical in nature, if that, perhaps molecular. We could argue and say it's almost really a fluid. So the moment that it becomes a fluid, it's actually existing within the second dimension. The moment that it becomes an electrical movement of energy, it's actually existing within the third dimension, right? So as you can imagine and relate to, when we say third dimension, this corresponded to, of course, the atmospheric base, didn't it? Now, there is a little bit of a crossover here as it relates to atmospheric base, because, of course, the fourth dimension is associated with the heart chakra, which is, of course, in the general area of the lungs. And anyone that has knowledge relating to the chakras will say that this corresponds to the air element here, doesn't it? The fire element here. So it's transferable, isn't it, between here? Why so? Well, look out next time there's a storm around, and you'll see the electricity moving through the Earth's atmosphere, won't you, in the form of lightning. And so that as that frequency of energy moves through the human body, what you get is a movement of energy called electricity within the nervous system and brain. And so that electrical movement propagates our thought waves into the body physiology in the form of electrum, that then drops down in vibration into the hormonal system and sets the fluid nature of energy in motion into our bloodstream, right? And that then that energy in the form of hormones moves outwardly into the physicality, assimilated through the DNA, through various processes that we won't go into, then to become the physical body mass, right? So that is how energy moves from thought into electrum, into the fluid moving form of hormonal expression, and then into the physicality. It's starting from non-physicality and moving outwardly into physicality, right? So that then this is actually the situation with the most human beings, is that they have just these three dimensions active of consciousness within their being. They have the base chakra, the sacral, the solar plexus, and so that their experience is that they have a physical body, they have an emotional body, they have a mental body, and that there isn't so much higher awareness which would begin at the heart center, and that would not be operational unless the fourth layer of the DNA was active, thereby allowing the fourth dimensional band to move through the heart chakra, right? And so that people experience this classically when they have a spiritual awakening, so that a spiritual awakening is, it can even happen on a mental level, but it really hasn't happened until this activates here, because the profound change that occurs, of course, is that your heart chakra being activated is that immediately, because the frequency field associated with the atmospheric base, you are breathing air all the time, your consciousness expands into union with the awareness of connection with all beings, because of course everybody's breathing the air, right? All the beings on the earth are breathing the air. The trees are breathing in our carbon dioxide. They're exhaling the oxygen. We inhale that. So that's the sort of common point of obvious union. And at the moment that you start to integrate that, you will start to feel, of course, have a greater appreciation of connection with the environment in which we allegedly inhabit, and perceive ourselves to be individuated from. So you'll, of course, be able to relate to people. You'll become more empathetic. You will care more about the environment. So these are the characteristics associated with this happening, right? Now, as these additional dimensions of consciousness activate, the fifth DNA strands activate, the fifth dimensional band begins to flow through the throat chakra, then you have corresponding changes in consciousness. One, you begin to attune to the truth within you, you start to speak it, you begin to be completely willing to stand in your truth, irrespective of what other people say, think, and do, because you're becoming more attuned to yourself. You know what you think and what you feel and what is true to you, and you're unafraid to walk that truth in spite of criticism, which is ultimately coming from people that are still stuck down here in particular on the mental wavelength, and they are associated and identified with competition, academia, intellectual concepts that ultimately create separation, because they're really on the wavelength of consciousness that is wanting to be right, wanting to be superior. It's a power frequency. I'm wanting to be better than you, so what I know is better than what you know. I'm right, and I'm going to prove it to you by having an argument with you. And what's more, I'm going to get you arguing so that I can beat you, and when I beat you, you're going to feel less than me, and I'm going to feel an elevation in that, because that'll be your life energy coming to me, because actually I'm a parasite and I don't quite realize that. It's actually my self-identity of self-importance that I haven't yet recognized, which is actually a negative, actually comes from a place of low self-esteem and insecurity, although I wouldn't necessarily recognize that, because I actually think that I'm quite brave and courageous as I go about my life telling people how important I really am and why everybody should listen to me, etc. Anybody relate to that? I'm sure that's a familiar story. So, yeah, as I said, I'm not going to go into elaborate detail into all these things in this webinar, because it's about other things and we'll run out of time. So obviously, the sixth DNA strand needs to activate to have the sixth dimension flowing through. The sixth energy center, your brow or third eye, opens up. You become connected to your soul more powerfully, and thereby you can become more intrinsically directed by that inner knowing, irrespective of what the outer environment is telling you you should do, right? And so on and so forth. The seventh layer of the DNA becomes activated, the seventh dimensional band becomes activated, the seventh chakra becomes activated, and then we move up and up through, of course, the dimensional scale. If you want to gain access to those additional levels of consciousness that I basically just explained previously, right? So this is how this works and how the actual process of ascension takes place. So to understand this, we need to understand the levels of identity. And here is our chakra man standing here within the dimensional field with the chakras corresponding to the related dimensions. And as you can see and imagine that, of course, if you just have these lower three chakras activated or energies flowing, then you'll only have the earth environment available to your perception. Nothing beyond that will be real to you. You'll be what is called a skeptic, and anyone that talks to you about spiritual concepts, which is ultimately what is from here to here, is just going to sound like a crackpot. You're probably going to take the piss out of them, etc., right? Because it's just not within the realms of your perception yet. So that is associated with the level of mind called your ego, right? You're all about proving yourself to others, and yet you haven't yet realized that everything that you do is all about proving yourself to others. You have to go about being loud, saying what you think in such a way that you're trying to dominate others. You know, you can't just sit quietly with what you think. You have to pipe up and have an argument with someone. That's not a humble way to approach life, and it's all about this need to prove who you are. So people get stuck in the teacher archetype, for example, and having to always talk about what they think they know, yet they don't realize that a person that really knows to a deeper level the truth about reality, they don't have to prove it to anyone. They just simply are it, right? And if nobody realizes that, well, that's their problem. It's not your problem. So that as you embody this deeper levels of awareness, and your fourth, your fifth, your sixth DNA strains activate, and you get these dimensional bands flowing through your consciousness, then of course the third eye being associated with the soul center, that is what is referred to as your soul. That is your soul consciousness. That is when you come into a deeper knowing of who you are, and the material playing grounds that you were otherwise previously interested in as an ego consciousness, the sensory pleasures, being loud and obnoxious, competing with everybody else, and also the less obvious egotistical expressions such as being very, very, very quiet and not wanting to be in the spotlight, because you haven't built up any confidence. That's equally valid as an ego experience. You haven't come into that depth of knowing as to who you are. These subside as your heart center is awakening and you are activating your throat and brow center to become truly attuned to your own intrinsic gifts and what it is that you truly want to do on this planet. So then these social, we could say, related experiences down here are going to subside to a deeper, meaningful purpose that is ultimately being driven by this level of consciousness here, and that you will become very, very focused on that. It won't matter if you don't have social support. It won't matter if your friends don't agree with you. It won't matter if everybody says that you're wrong or you shouldn't do that or has a social opinion, blah, blah, blah. It won't matter, because you know that the truth within you is more powerful and more true to you than what the world is reflecting to you down here in the material playing ground. Okay, so that is known as your soul consciousness. Now, as, of course, a continuing field of awareness develops through the higher levels of awareness, this is referred to as your oversoul. You are now embodied to the degree that your consciousness could exist here at fifth density, or probably what some people are referring to as the fifth dimension. See the ambiguity there, of course. Fifth dimension, fifth density. No, fifth dimension's down here. It's part of the second harmonic universe, or the fourth density. Note the difference, right? But that we can't exist there immediately upon ascending our mind to that level of awareness. Because why? Because our physicality exists here in the first harmonic universe corresponding to Earth. If you wanted to actually take your body with you up into these higher levels, now that is what we are calling biological transmutation and dimensional ascension. Now, you cannot achieve that until you either achieve a consciousness here, where you'd need to activate the corresponding chakras of the 10th, 11th, and 12th dimensional fields, which would activate your avatar mind. Now, Paramahansa Yogananda is an example of an avatar. Patanjali, of course, Krishna, the Buddha. Some might argue that some of these beings are actually rishis up here, higher levels of awareness. In any case, these beings have transcended to the point where at this level of awareness and that level of consciousness, they are actually perceiving, they're so expanded, their mind is so enormous and penetrating that your consciousness perceives the very essence of matter at the most fundamental form. And so that would be what we refer to as atoms, wouldn't it? And subatomic particles. So that just as an ego consciousness, you have raw, basic control over your physicality. You could note that by simply outstretching your fingers in front of you. That's the current level of control that you have. Clench your fist. You're able to do that. Well, the avatar mind or the solar rishi, or even at the oversoul level, they can facilitate transmutation to the extent that they can shape shift their body into a different form, that they can take the physical atoms and completely turn it into light, and thereby become not only a wavelength frequency corresponding to these harmonic universes, but they can ultimately transform all the way out into an antimatter field up here as a solar rishi, which is an antiparticle really, or all the way out into the sound fields in which they completely upfold their body. That is, they have no more dimensional expression, that their mind is completely absorbed in the reverberating sound fields of the primal sound fields, right? Just various tones and frequencies of unified awareness. So that you would have to achieve that within the current time cycle that we are in to upfold your body and literally disappear and move through dimensional ascension with your current physical body. So that is only possible by reaching those levels of awareness, or at certain time periods throughout what is called the Uego cycle, which happens every 26,556 years. I detailed this cycle further in my previous webinar, The Great Awakening, etc. You'll find that on the YouTube channel. So if you wanted to look into that, go ahead and do that at some point, at a later point. But every 26,556 years, we move through what is referred to as an ascension cycle, through which the entire planet, the whole particle base, has the opportunity in shifting in its operation up into the next harmonic universe, right? So that's called a planetary ascension, and that would be equivalent to all of the life forms shifting from the ego experience, embodying their soul, and moving what were previously material particles, physical matter, into light particles, right? So remember the experience that I described? So as we are ascending upwards, then everything is becoming less dense. And so that it just so happens that that is what we are moving through right now. And if you do a bit of research, I'm sure people on this webinar are familiar with the Ascension and all of that concepts. But if this is new to you, particularly people that would view this webinar at a later point in time, just go ahead and research Planetary Ascension. You'll find a huge amount of information on this. But now you have a concept, a greater concept, particularly if you go back to the webinar that I did, The Great Awakening. It will really outline for you what that means in a sense of the planet moving all the way up. So that why this is so important right now is because, look, either you have the DNA and chakra corresponding to those dimensions activated and the energy field flowing through you, or you don't, right? So if you don't have these activated and you only have your consciousness expression through the ego, in other words, dimensions 1, 2, and 3, what you're going to find is that as the interdimensional energies come through what is referred to as the stellar activation cycle, as cosmic rays penetrate from the core of this galaxy and beyond, from various interstellar locations like the Pleiades, like Sirius, like Arcturus, like even Orion, Andromeda, and beyond. These interdimensional currents, because they are such high frequency cosmic rays, they are going to cause an acceleration in the Earth's particle base. And as that takes place, everything will begin to speed up. So if you don't have yourself aligned with this particle base by moving into your soul identity, what you'll find is that you will have all sorts of problems manifesting in your physical body, right? So there'll be rapid disease occurring. There'll be dysfunction, pain, breaking down within the body as your body moves into what is called molecular compaction, because it cannot handle the wavelength frequencies that are coming into the planet. Now, I don't say that because I'm trying to scare anyone. I'm just giving you the information, and it's what you choose to do with it is up to you. But if you look around at the moment, what you'll see is that what is manifesting in the collective experience with this coronavirus, as it were, interestingly enough, corona refers in one sense to the sun too, doesn't it? There's a corona on the sun. Is that actually a lot of people are dying off, aren't they? A lot of people are dying off either directly through the vaccine or through suicide or various other means, natural disasters. So this is just one of the ways in which souls are choosing to leave the planet because they are, for whatever reason, not ready to move through this shift, right? Now, that's all I'm going to say about that for now, because we've got a lot more to go through. I hope you found that interesting. Go back to the reference I made about the other webinar if you want to find out more. But we're going to move on for now, right? So how is this done? Right. Now, it's as simple as this, right? The most powerful and effective way to achieve this is, of course, through activating your DNA. So at the moment, as I pointed out, literally this is the situation for most people. All of these dimensional fields are not part of their current awareness. They literally don't get it. They are existing just down here. They are in their intellect. They will be like, well, that's not currently proven by science. There's no academic tests to to reference here, so it's not real. So I don't mean to be insincere or take the piss by using that nerdy voice, but it kind of points to this blind academic class, we could say, that are reliant on the intellect, which represents this wavelength frequency of the mental body, that they have completely given their power away to the outer field of so-called proof, haven't they? That means, does it not, that the truth is not inside of them, it is outside of them. So that means, how are you ever going to become empowered on a soul level if you genuinely believe that absolutely everybody else knows better? So you'd better listen to everybody else. Now, as an intellectual concept, that's confusing, because to a degree, it's actually a humble position too, isn't it? Because you're saying, I don't know everything. I'm guessing that the experts out there know better than me, and so I'm kind of just going to, take what they have to say as a given. But there is a degree of naivety associated with that, because along with that comes the assumption that the so-called experts actually know what they're talking about. Now, I might sound a little bit arrogant when I laugh about experts not knowing, supposedly, as I might suggest, what they're talking about. But you know what? If you look into what's happening with the coronavirus right now and what the so-called experts are saying, at least some of them that are getting perhaps coverage in the mainstream media, what you're going to find is that actually they are not telling the truth. Either they don't know because their mind has been phase-locked into this limited identity called an ego, and they're simply not aware of a higher truth that would exist up here. Or, now here's another consideration, because they are stuck on the third dimensional level of the mind, their playing ground is in power and manipulation, right? So that if they aren't intrinsically empowered through the heart and soul center and high energy centers through which that divine current from prime source creator can flow to them, then they have to source the energy from others, don't they? Now, how do we go about that? Is that we come up with a crafty kind of narrative through which others will believe what we say and perhaps become part of our camp, we could say. We could say they are customers of ours, and so that you'll be well familiar with the so-called marketing strategy of using various ways of appealing to your intellect, basically trying to get you to believe that you need their product. Now, aren't you sick of this consciousness? Bad choice of words, perhaps. Are you tired of this consciousness? Have you had enough of this consciousness that is constantly at you and trying to bully you, essentially, into believing that you need them? You need them. You need their help. You need their product. And so it's like you're walking down the street and you can't even avoid on a physical level people confronting you. Do you want this? Do you need this? You go online and you've got various ads bombarding you. And so that this is the outcome of a big, enormous field of consciousness existing in this desperate, separated, egotistical, disempowered field of energy through which you have to essentially parasite off of others, right? So that's a situation. And not only that, but because these DNA strands are inactive, the ones down here, they have become very murky and almost like a quagmire of dysfunction, because we don't have higher clarity from the soul or higher levels of awareness, and that even within the mental and emotional and the physical centers, because they've become so dysfunctional, they've accumulated blockages that, isn't it obvious? Look around you to see the level of mental disease and dysfunction that you can see in the general population, And of course, the general population, I don't mean to sound condescending or arrogant in this way, but from a certain perspective, we could say a centered perspective up here, you would look down at these levels of awareness and you would just see, look at them like, oh my God, people have gone absolutely crazy. They will believe anything. They have just lost it. So, I don't have to really provide much evidence at this point as to why there's blockages in the mental center, do I? Now, how many people are losing it emotionally, just going psychotic, in moods, depressed, on medication? We could go on as to the damage within the collective emotional body, which corresponds to this energy center. And of course we have, and I've talked to it, the physical disease manifesting, haven't we? Sexual issues. Now, we're not going to go into the abuse of power in relation to sexual energies at the moment, but that is very pertinent right now with human trafficking and crimes against humanity, child abuse, information starting to become more prominent in the social mind. And this, of course, comes from what? Blockages, distortions in this energy center. And this one here as well, right? This is survival and sex, but this is pleasure. So that the way in which you derive your pleasure as it relates to the sexual expression, I mean, obviously this is corresponding to your organs down here. Now, some people derive their pleasure. It is associated with children and they are adults. Of course, you'll be well familiar with. So you see how blocked and distorted and what a quagmire and swamp this has become down here. This is why. Because these higher energy centers and levels of DNA are not active, and therefore they don't have those higher divine, inspired and guided and directed powers to assist them to take the right choice, which has notoriously been, historically been, the focus of religion, hasn't it? Just choose a higher path, just be a good person. And yet, over time, haven't humanity failed to live up to that expectation, and that religious, to a degree, has only become a greater inhibition on the shoulders of burdened individuals that try to live up to this paradigm of intrinsic purity and perfection, and yet they cannot, because they are the dysfunctional ego, and they don't know how to get all of this operating. And I'm sorry if your paradigm is Christian, for example, and that you believe that if you just focus on Jesus, that everything is going to be achieved. In my experience, focusing on somebody else, and perhaps inarguably at a deeper level, Jesus, ultimately representing the Christ consciousness, is who we are at a deeper level. It is our self at a deeper level. It is the so-called external personification of the deepest element within us, the avatar mind, that aside from the ones that can go further into the Rishi, solar Rishi mind, etc., but that perhaps that is the deeper truth. But still, if you are thinking that so long as you say, Jesus has absorbed me into heaven, I no longer need to do the work within myself, this is a great bastardization and distortion of the original concept of Christianity, which is detailed extensively by Paramahansa Yogananda in the Second Coming of Christ, for example. So anyway, I'm going on and on again, and I need to move on. But ultimately, what can we do about this, right? This situation. So one way in which I approach this with people is that I encourage them to get onto this program, which is called the Lightning Path. Now, again, that's not a name intrinsic to me. It is a name that I've taken from the great masters that have historically appeared throughout history, such as Jesus, such as Patanjali, such as Primavata Paramahansa Yogananda, Lahiri Mahasaya, Sri Yukteswar, Giri, his master, and of course Mahavatar Babaji, and all of the other avatars throughout history have always referred to this incredible way through which people can rapidly regenerate themselves, right? And so they referred to it as the lightning path. So you can go onto my website, humanmetamorphosis.com, and learn a little bit more about that. Just look for it under services. But ultimately, that is the fastest way, right? Now, I'm going to go into the 5 pathways of ascension now that you can most rapidly achieve all that I've just been talking about. Now, there's, of course, more than 5 different ways. And this, in a sense, is not 5 different ways. It's 5 facets of the same way. It's 5 facets of this primordial way that has been called Sanatama Dharma by the great yogic tradition, which translates roughly as eternal religion. It is not religion. It is what has always been. If you consider what I have just said and went over about the universal construct, that is not something that any religion can own. That is simply the way in which the universe manifests. It is not owned by any collective individuals or particular person or group. It is simply reality. And the more that we understand our relationship with reality, which is really what Taoism tends to talk to, is our relationship with the universe, what is actually seen not in some intangible realm of heaven, but what is here and now and that we can experience, but that can relate to everybody. And what I love about that is that then you can't say that nobody else is good enough. You can't say that this is a special club. You can't say that somebody is excluded, because no one is excluded to this club. We all exist in this reality, do we not? And we are all subject to the rules of this reality, are we not? And that if you don't believe that, well, just go up to the roof of your house and try jumping off and just see how you go there, Of course, don't do that. But what you immediately find is that gravity actually is going to work for you. Likewise, try holding your breath and just see how long you last. So the law of energy exchange that we call breathing, well, this is a necessary process for us all, isn't it? Isn't it humbling to think that we are all even when it comes down to it, isn't it? So let's move into these 5 pathways. These are very powerful ideas. I certainly encourage you to stay on for this part of the webinar. Listen carefully, perhaps take maybe a minute's break or so if you need to go to the toilet, and have a drink of water, and then get underway with the second part shortly.